Good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for coming out to support this event this evening. My name's Mark. I'm one of the library assistants here in Crediton. Although this is not a Crediton library event per se, this event is organised by the Friends of Crediton Library, of which there are various members here assisting this evening. The Friends of Crediton Library exist to help us to fund various things that we would find it difficult to fund through the normal means within the library service. So, for example, the Friends have bought recently laptop video projector and screen so that we can have PowerPoint presentations and screen films and things, blackout blinds for the windows. All these kinds of extras are all paid for by the Friends, who are a bunch of volunteers who get together and put on events like this to fundraise and help us. There are lots of leaflets about the Friends over on the refreshment table, or speak to Paul or anybody else who's here if you want to know any more, or you would like to join and help with these sorts of things. That would be fantastic. So thank you for that. It's my great pleasure to present Michael and Karen to talk with you as well as at you, I think, this evening. They probably don't need much of an introduction, but I'm going to give them one anyway, whether they want to hear it or not, probably. Mr. Jex, along with myself and a couple of other people in the room, is a member of the Exeter Authors Association, probably the most illustrious member of the Exeter Authors Association.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, right. It's as close as it gets. Mike was born in Surrey before moving down here and became a writer in 1994. Since then, he has written a large number of books. The first
How
books,
many?
It's about 150,000, I think. 46?
42.
42, and 4 in production, so 46. There we go. That's pretty close. The first books that you wrote, I believe, is the start of the Templar series. Now the longest running crime series by any author who is not yet dead. Please keep going.
Yeah, this could be dodgy for you.
Between 1999 and 2001, Mike was the organiser of the debut dagger for new authors for the Crime Writers Association, of which he was also chairman in 2004 and 2005. He also, along with other eminent authors, formed Medieval Murderers, which is kind of the guise of this evening's event, as a kind of performance group of authors, along with Karen, Chris Sansom, and how many other people? Quite a few.
Bernard Knight, Ian Morse and Susanna Gregory.
Thank you.
They're the other ones.
So seven in total.
Yeah.
Karen is not a member of Exeter Authors Association,
Yet.
but the night is not yet over. There is still time. Karen moved to Devon quite recently, which is why she hasn't been twisted into being a member of Exeter Authors Association yet. Before that, she lived in Lincoln, where she found inspiration for a number of her novels. Karen's also spent a lot of time travelling. Malta in your early childhood, is this correct? And Iceland and various other places about which I'm sure we will hear something in due course. Karen began writing in 1996, so 2 years after Mr. Jex, and has a number of medieval thrillers to her name, as well as contributions to the Medieval Murderers series. I hope that gives you a brief introduction that I did not raid at all from your biography. Please entertain the masses.
True, we've got to do that as well.
Yeah.
Well, thanks a lot for coming around. Karen and I, as was mentioned, are both members of Medieval Murderers. There was a performance group that was set up purely, really, because a whole bunch of us, Bernard Knight and Susanna Gregory and Ian Mawson and I used to meet up on the circuit at different author events and festivals. And we'd always meet up. I seemed to be the one who were always there, and others would turn up at different times. And I said to Bernard once, it really is probably quite a nice idea if we could all have a platform together and we could do talks together. He said, yes, that's a nice idea. I said, how can we meet up and discuss this? So as with almost all Medieval Murderers events, we met in a pub. And Susanna Gregory joined, and we had a wonderful time. Karen joined a little bit later. and we had several very pleasant events with her. And we decided after a while that just giving talks was a bit too much like a holiday. So instead we decided we'd write books as well. We've actually got a series of 10 books now where they're all collaborative novels. But the nice thing is that Bernard writes about the 1100s, Ian writes about the 1200s, I've got the 1300s pre-plague, Susanna had 1300s post-plague, Karen's a sort of wandering spirit around medieval period, Phil Gooden was a token modernist because he was Shakespeare's time, and because we had such a spread of different periods, we could write novels that were based on things like a sword or a building or something that went over time, and we could have, rather than a series of short stories, we could have a series of novellas that would develop into one novel. So it seems like a lot of work, but actually the main part of it was all discussed in a pub beforehand, and it turned out quite easy. That was fun. But today we're here. You've heard a little bit about me. What I think would be good to start with is just to give you a feel about what it is that we do and how we work. The first thing always that people ask is, well, how do you do your research? And the easy answer is we sit down and read, pretty much, isn't it?
Yeah.
Where do you do your research now?
A lot of it comes from, still comes from libraries. I'm a huge fan of libraries of all kinds. And one of the great things about local libraries in particular is that they very often have a buried archive or local history section which hasn't yet got online because nobody is into that kind of thing. And you find in them very often a pamphlet written by some vicar. It's always vicars, isn't it? They always seem to have all this time on their hands. I mean, when they're not out shooting and hunting and fishing, then they're writing about some local folklore. And a lot of my novels, I write standalone medieval thrillers, but an awful lot of my novels are based on superstition and myth and magic of the time. And I try to see the world as it would have been seen in the Middle Ages. So, for example, if you were living in the Middle Ages and one day the family had this nice bit of pork that had sort of fallen off the back of a cart, and you popped it in the cooking pot on a Sunday, and you'd all eaten your sort of pork stew. And then a week later, one of your children suddenly swells up and they start to vomit blood and they're in terrible pain, and 24 hours later they're dead. What are you going to think as a medieval mother? What are you going to think has caused this? You're not going to relate what happened to that one child to the meal that you ate 7 days ago and everybody else was fine and everybody else still is fine. You're immediately going to think, well, maybe it's the lady, you know, little Johnny went out yesterday and he was kicking a football around and he broke this lady's pots and she came out and shouted at him. Was that the cause? Is she a witch? Has she put a curse on him? Nowadays, it's very easy to say, okay, we know that was anthrax. And what happened was that little Johnny ate, unfortunately, the one piece of meat that had the spore on it and got intestinal anthrax, and therefore he died, which was quite common in the Middle Ages. But my goal is to try and see it as see the events as they would have seen them. So I use a lot of myth and magic. I also use a lot of try and look for something that's got a resonance now. So that, for example, in the Plague Charmer, we're talking a lot about human trafficking, particularly the trafficking of children, and I came across the idea that in the Middle Ages, that because there was a shortage of dwarves, and I'll go into that later, that people took babies and they actually tried to make dwarves of babies so that they could be sold on the black market, you know, one human being to another, as sort of slaves and as jesters and so on, which is sort of kind of what's going on now. We're not making dwarves of people, but we are trafficking in children.
I don't
we
think
are
there's a
doing that
shortage of
kind
them now, that's the difference.
Not a shortage of tools now. So that's basically where my research tends to start. But I find, and I don't know if Mike finds the same thing, that when you're doing research, you research your sort of general subject matter, your kings and your queens and your fashion and all of that kind of thing. But then as you're writing, you suddenly start to think, you're suddenly in the middle of a scene and you think, okay, I want somebody to pick a herb by accident that resembles something that they think they could put in the cooking pot, but actually turns out to be poison. So you find yourself sitting at home going through all of these books of herbs, thinking what was growing on a volcano in Iceland in July that somebody could remotely think was an edible herb and turns out to be poisonous. And something else that you might sort of come across, like, you know, I mean, quite simply in one of my, in my first novel, the guy had his trousers, had to take his trousers off, his breeches off in the middle of the novel. And you're suddenly halfway through the scene and you think, yeah, but how did they keep them on? You know, was it a button? Was it a drawstring? What was it? And you find that all the way through your novel, you're having to constantly stop and look up those details which you never thought you were going to need to know.
Which is why your library at home tends to be quite eclectic, doesn't
Yes.
it? Yes. I've got, I think it's about 6,000 books now, most of them for research. And in my office I've got lots of straight chronicles, lots of history books. I've got the history of the Tower of London, got the history of the Bastille because I found it cheap in a bookshop in London a few weeks ago. But then I've also got the history of chemical engineering, I've got the history of alchemy, I've got the history of mental illness and how it was treated in the medieval period. Another book I found in a second-hand bookshop in London. I've got, and these things just grow like topsy. I've got one great book, two books in fact, which are all about making swords, how you make a sword. Probably means Special Branch will be knocking on the door sometime soon. But, I've also got another book called The Big Bang. It's the first book where I've written to a guy to say, this book is fascinating. It's called The Big Bang because it's all about explosives and all the types of explosives it could use. It came out in about 98, 99. And it was written by a recently retired chemistry teacher at a school who was obviously a frustrated terrorist or something. And he had this wonderful book, and I wrote to him and said, just really brilliant actually, I just couldn't put the book down. He wrote back and said, that's the first fan letter I've ever had. Done something right. But research is so difficult because you can sit down, and I'll bore them now. I once, every time you think of a book, you think of a story, and I'm currently writing the third book in one series, and I was asked yesterday, what's it called? I haven't got the first flaming idea. I do not know, because I can write a 120,000 word novel without a problem. I can write short stories with a certain amount of effort, but trying to think of a title is really difficult. And I once had to submit 2 pages of A4 with double line spaced, a different title on every other line for my editor to try to pick something. And the great name that we ended up with was The Boy Bishop's Glovemaker, which sounds like a zippy sort of thriller, doesn't it? But you can imagine what the rest of the titles were like. But once I had a great idea. I thought, I'll name the book Widdicombe Fair. I thought everybody's heard of Widdicombe Fair, and if they haven't heard of Widdicombe Fair, they've probably heard the song, they probably have some sort of relation with it. So I put that through to my agent. She said, yes, that's a good idea. Good. She put it up to the editor and she said yes, so I was away. So I went up to the British Library, back in the good old days when it was the nice round reading room, before they had this horrible brick thing that they've built now. It used to be lovely. You'd go up there and you could sit down and you could ask for books, you'd write out your demand on a little slip of paper and give it to the librarian. And normally, on average, it was about 3 days later the book would arrive, because all the books were stored in an airfield up in Lincoln. There wasn't space in London. Now you go up there and ask for a book and it's there in 20 minutes, but it's not the same. So I went up there and I spent a week looking for details about Widdicombe Fair, and there was nothing at all. And it's not surprising really, because there was 2 floods, I think, of the British Library during the 1800s. Hitler did a certain amount of damage with some firebombs, and there's been a lot of reasons why books disappear. There was a famous incident where a lawyer's clerk decided he was going to make himself some extra money, and he hit on the idea that he'd go through all of the divorce records of the York ecclesiastical court, and he was going to collate all of these into a set of precedents that he could sell to all the lawyers in York. Brilliant idea. So he went through all of these records and he formed two piles. One was the list that was going to go in his precedents, and the other was his firelighters. So half of the records were trashed in the 1700s, bless him. So there's reason why things disappeared, but I wasn't downhearted. I came down to Devon and I went through the Devon Archives, I went through the Folk Office, I went to the Devon and Exeter Institution, I went to Devon and Cornwall Record Society, I went to the university, and I got absolutely nothing after another 3 days. So in the end I was talking to one of the archivists and I said, can you tell me anything? Is there anywhere else I can go to find out anything about Widdicombe Bloody Fair? And she said, ask the cathedral librarian, because he knows everything. Like, right, okay. So I phoned up the cathedral librarian, and a nice lady answered the phone, and these footsteps sort of went away. It was obviously a paved floor, because I could hear her feet going away. And then somebody came along with slightly louder footsteps, and that was the librarian. He said, hello. I said, hello, my name's Michael Jakes, I'm an author. I'm trying to find out anything I can about Widdicombe Fair in the 1300s. He said, you'll find that a problem. I said, why? Widdicombe Fair started 1800s. And that's the trouble with research. You never know whether you're actually going down completely the wrong route anyway.
Titles are a difficult thing anyway, because you can come up with, or one can come up with what one thinks is an absolutely first-class title. But the actual decision about title is not made by the author, it's not made actually by the editor, it's generally made by the buyers of the books, the potential buyers of the books. And I had a situation where I'd written a book called The Mandrake's Tale, which was, everybody agreed was a title that they loved, and we based the entire book around this, and it was actually narrated by a mandrake, and one of the reviewers said it was the first time he'd ever read a book written by a root vegetable. But that's beside the point. But for those of you who don't know, mandrake is a plant that the leaves appear to grow straight out of the earth, but when you pull it up, it resembles a little human being. It's got a sort of head and four sort of things that could look like limbs. And it was a plant that people considered was a demigod. It was a sacred plant, but also they thought it was actually alive. And they thought that it grew where a man was being executed, where his semen fell into the ground from the gallows as at the moment of death, the mandrake would spring up. So it's quite an important plant. Anyway, we called the entire book The Mandrake's Tale. It came to the day before it was due to print, and it was shown to the buyers, who all went, no, you can't call it The Mandrake's Tale because everybody will think it's about a duck. And so at that point, we all had to, emails were going frantically backwards and forwards, and it eventually became The Gallows Curse, because that's how the mandrake is created. But, you know, titles are a tricky thing, aren't they?
I hate titles, I really do. It's next to impossible to think of something that can summarise an entire story. And when you do summarise, the nice thing is contracts for authors always say, it's okay, you've got full control over the title, you've got you've got full control over the copy editing and the proofreading, and you've got full control of the story, don't they? They always say that. They're lying. They're bloody teeth. They don't give a damn. You send off a title and say, that's the one I want. They say, nah, I don't like that. Send them
I
another one.
always like when you were talking about, because you actually had a cover design before you'd written the book, didn't you?
Oh, hell. Yeah, there's this lovely thing where every so often, I used to write 2 books a year with headline, and every now and again it would happen where they'd get through to you and say, look, could you just give us an outline of what the book's about. I said, yeah, okay. So you'd have to give them a briefing in a small number of paragraphs. So it would be something along the lines of, okay, it's night time, there's a body lying under a hedge, there's a dog in the corner, there's a woman running away into some woods, something. And then the artist will go away and design a cover that suits that. Brilliant. So I was writing a book once, hadn't quite finished it, and they said, could you give us a jacket briefing for the next book? And I said, yeah, the next book, you've got the synopsis. I said, no, not that one. You've already given us a briefing for that one. We want the one that you're going to write after that. So, what do you mean the one after? I hadn't even thought of that. I said, oh, just if you could, we've got a couple of artists and they haven't got anything to do. So, all right. So I had this brilliant idea. I thought, I know a Devon cross, good old-fashioned Devon cross, with ivy crawling up it, and 2 skulls at the bottom of it, and another one on top. I thought, brilliant image. So I sent that off, and they said, yeah, that's fantastic. And I went on with my book, and then I got on with the next book after that, and halfway through the next book after that, this cover arrived with this lovely picture of a cross with 3 skulls on it, and I thought, what the hell was I thinking of? That was really very problematic. I had to invent a story and try to get it working. But other times, I mean, I had a jacket where they sent me this brilliant cover that had a picture of a sword with a rosary with red beads dangling off it. Very good, very effective cover. I had no idea what the hell the rosary is about, so I contacted my editor and said, what's it about? And he said, I don't know, but it looks good, doesn't it? So I had to write 3 extra scenes for that book just to incorporate this blasted rosary.
I mean, we actually had that problem really with a lot of the medieval murderers books, because going back to those, we used to, as Mike said, we used to dream up these ideas in pubs, didn't we? And which is quite creative, because, you know, after
quite a few of them couldn't be used.
a couple of glasses. And we used to have to send off each of us a little brief synopsis of what our novella was going to be about. Well, generally, when that request comes in, you're in the middle of a deadline for another novel, and suddenly somebody wants this synopsis of, you know, 6 lines yesterday, and you think, oh, well, and you start to write these few lines, and then a few months later you come to write the book, or you come to write the novella. And I had written one, I think, I can't even remember which of the stories it was for, but mine was set in Ely Cathedral, my novella, and I put in the synopsis, and the severed head is found on top of Ely Cathedral, and the agent wrote back and said, wonderful, I really like that, you know, really, really good. And I got to the point where I was about to write the novel, and I thought, what possessed, how are they going to get a severed head up Ely Cathedral? So, and that only came about because I'd actually gone to Ely Cathedral, and I'd done one of the roof tours up there, because I'd had to do some filming for a book up there. And when I was up there, I could see all these gargoyles which are not actually visible from the ground, and they're only visible to the people who created them, which is quite amazing up there. And I was looking at all these heads, and I thought, wouldn't that be a wonderful place to put a head? Without, as Mike said, and then you've got to think through, you've then got to start and do the research, and you've got to think, well, okay, how did somebody get up in the Middle Ages to the rooftop of Ely Cathedral? Was the door kept locked? How many doors were there? How would you have actually got past the people who guarded it? And that's when your problems really begin, isn't it?
Yes, you start off with the best of ideas. You have a great idea for a dead body somewhere, and as soon as you start writing it, you immediately have the number of problems that immediately kick in. As oh hell, that couldn't actually have been there at that time of year because that was the wrong time of year, or that bit of where that is, the ground's too damn muddy and you would have been able to find it. Or I had a lovely one where I dug up a body and it was all brown and stained, as it would be on Dartmoor. And the nice thing about Bernard Knight is that he was the Home Office pathologist that dug up all of Fred West's bodies. He knows his dead corpses. And so every time we had a problem, we used to phone up Bernard and say, well, how long would a body have lasted in a peak? Oh, I don't know, really. could be any time really. He wrote the definitive book on how you find out time of death. Yeah, you know how in all the crime series on TV, there's a bright chap who wanders up and he said, "Oh yeah, I died about 15 minutes ago." Bernard had a rule of thumb. He would go to one of the police officers and say, "When was the body found?" And he'd hear that. And then he'd go to someone else and say, "When was the person last seen alive?" And he'd take that. And then when he was asked, "When did the body die?" he'd say, "It's in between then and then." There's no other rule of thumb, there's no other rule that works. You cannot tell, because temperature changes, body changes with temperature. And yeah, he used to drive him potty every time he watched any TV programmes. He actually used to be the script writer or consultant for, what was that series called? I've forgotten the name now.
Yeah.
There was...
It's a silent witness, the one of
No, it was before that. There was a forensic science series with a very large, bluff British actor back in the 70s, or earlier even it might have been. And Bernard was the lead consultant on that, and he used to get absolutely furious because this actor loved ad-libbing. And so you'd get halfway through a scene and the actor would say, "Go and x-ray that blood." And he'd Bernard in the background, "No, you don't x-ray blood."
And I think Bernard was also the one who taught us that all of this thing of, you know, well, they had spaghetti bolognese and a nice bottle of Beaujolais and whatever. Forget it. They possibly had a meal.
Yes,
is about as far
much
as you
easier.
can get.
Yeah.
You can get to. I think the other interesting thing, though, I find in terms of writing crime, mine are mainly thrillers, but there is a very high body count, which is why my agent always says I could never actually write a sequel because everybody's dead by the end. There's nobody really to carry on. But one of the interesting things I think about the Middle Ages was that, of course, they didn't have the forensic examination, the forensic scientists or anything, but neither did they have the police force or anybody like that. And I worked for a while in Nigeria, living in a rural village without water and electricity and so on, so it was very much a kind of medieval situation. And one of the things you become very acutely aware of is how much you depend on the community around you. If a house burns down, or a hut, there is no sending for the police, for the fire brigade, there's no sending for an ambulance or anything. Either your neighbours help you to put it out, or they don't, and if you're in some way excommunicated from the community, which happened a lot in the Middle Ages, they would stand there and watch it burn, and that would be it. And so I think one of the joys for me writing about the Middle Ages is that our characters are very plausibly on their own. I think one of the problems for a modern crime writer is they spend an awful lot of time explaining why all the lights have gone out, you can't use a mobile phone, you can't use the computer, you can't use anything else.
Do you ever get
to summon
you get to a
help.
point in one of those books where all of a sudden in the first chapter they're going somewhere and the phone doesn't work and you think that's coming back later, isn't it? Sorry,
We don't have to explain any of that away. And our characters are thrown back on their own resources, because if they have a mad axeman on the doorstep, they've got to actually deal with it. I mean, there's no sending for the police or anything like that. But in contrast, I think the other thing is, for me, people would have been a lot more familiar with death in those days, that they would have slaughtered their own animals, they would have seen people die in their own homes. I mean, death wasn't taken out to the community, it was in the community. They would have walked past the gibbet with a dead body decomposing, you know, from day one until it actually literally fell out the bottom, having rotted completely away. So they would know the stages of decomposition, they would know when a corpse went stiff and so on and so forth. So I think the average ordinary amateur would have been far more knowledgeable about death than a policeman would today, who probably wouldn't deal with it.
No, I agree.
That's,
Well, the nice thing was that death in those days was also a really good money maker. The whole concept of a coroner was just to make tax revenue for the king. The coroner wasn't there to investigate a crime, it was purely and simply to raise revenue. So if you had a dead body found in a field, The first thing that you had to do by law was contact the coroner. Well, you had to contact all of the local neighbours. If you were in a town like Exeter, then you had to contact the 4 or 5 nearest families to the dead body, so that they could all come and say, oh, yep, it's dead. Then you had to get the coroner, and the coroner would come, and the first thing he'd do would be to say, okay, you're the person who found the body, you're the first finder, so you are therefore going to have to turn up at my coroner's court when it comes, and to make sure you turn up, you've got to pay me the money now. So anybody that had to turn up to court had to pay. There was fines imposed for anything. The fact that the body was found in the parish meant there was another fine. There was a fine for the type of weapon that, or whatever it was that caused the death. It didn't have to be a weapon. If you were unfortunate, you fell into a mill, then the mill wheel was, or the value of the mill wheel had to go to the king. It was called deodand. It was a great little law and a very good money spinner. They only got rid of it when, in the age of new steam trains, a train flattened someone and the train company said, you are not getting the value of the entire bloody train. But before that, I mean, there was a famous case in Devon back in the 1300s where a boy was run over by a horse and cart. And so the coroner turned up and he valued the horse and cart, said that's worth 1 and 6. And the local jury said, wasn't the horse and cart that killed him, it was 1 wheel. A wheel's only worth 2pence, so that's what you're getting. And he said, you lot are fired, and he got a jury in from the next village, and they say, yeah, all right. But it used to be quite often that if you found a body, oddly enough, you would be likely to find lots of bodies in the next few months, because you only got fined the one time for finding a body. So if your neighbour stumbled over a corpse a couple of days later, you say, "Here, Mike, look, you've already got done. Why don't you find this one as well?" Or what used to happen quite a lot was, if you found a body, it could be just close to the parish boundary, and you'd think, well, they're all right, so you'd shift it a few yards.
There's a wonderful example of that where a body was found and the parish boundary ran down the centre of a bridge, and
Yes.
the people who found it took the body and put it over the other side of the bridge into the next parish. And the workers coming to work that morning discovered the body, and so they put it back on the other side. And the body ended up with 2 sets of parishioners, one with the feet, one with the head, pushing it backwards and forwards over the boundary on the bridge, like a kind of reverse tug of war, to try and get it into the other parish. And in the end, they overtoppled, and the body went over the bridge, and they all sort of shook hands and said, "Oh, well, somebody else floated downstream." So, but you find examples like that in the records, and that's the joy of the court records,
Yeah.
isn't it? That you find these odd little snippets. And I think, going back to research, people often say to me, do you do your own research? Well, apart from the fact I couldn't possibly afford to pay anybody to do it for me, nobody else would know what to look for, because very often when you set out to look up one thing and then you stumble over something that nobody else
You never
would
know
realise.
what you're looking for
No,
at the beginning, do you? Because the stories develop as you. I mean, there was one of my books where I wanted to write a bit about Walter Stapleton, and Bishop Stapleton at Exeter was a good chap, but in the early 1300s he was a canon at the cathedral, and he had a little bit of a sticky period when he was first elevated to bishop, because other people argued that he shouldn't be allowed to be, because back in the early 1300s, before he was elevated, there was a guy called Henry de Raleigh who died, very sad, and Henry de Raleigh wanted to make sure that he got pole position when it came to Judgment Day, and what you would do in those days was you'd pay a certain amount of money and hopefully you would be buried in front of the altar. The nearer you were to the altar, the better it was. But Exeter Cathedral was a bit full, so he went to the Dominicans down the road and said, "Tell you what, you let me live with you while I'm," because he was quite old, he knew he was dying, so he said, "You let me stay with you as a pensioner, you can have all of my wealth when I die, but I want that position there." And they said, "Yep, that's fair." Sadly, he died. These things do happen. And they laid out the body. They did what they normally do. They had lots of good fine materials. They got the hearse, which was a frame that went over the body. They got lots of candles. It was a big investment for a good funeral. And they had the body laid out, and a short time after they laid out all the body and everything, a bunch of thugs came in, broke the rood screen, pinched the body, nicked all the candles, all the best clothing and everything else, and disappeared. It was two canons with a whole bunch of staff from the cathedral, because Exeter had a complete monopoly on burials in those days, Exeter Cathedral. There's no church in Exeter before, I think, the 1600s that was allowed to bury anybody in Exeter. So the cathedral had a complete monopoly. And the reason why they wanted to maintain that monopoly was it was really good business. It was very valuable. So they took all of the stuff that was worthwhile, held the funeral service, and then sent a messenger back to the Dominicans and said, you can have him now. And the Dominicans sent a messenger back and said, you can bloody keep it. And so the cathedral thought, well, we don't want him. So they got a bunch of the servants and picked up the body and carried it to the Dominicans, who heard that they were coming and locked the gates. So the staff of the cathedral thought, well, we're not carrying him all the bloody way back. So they dumped him outside the gates and left him there for 3 days. I think this was July. The city got a little bit peeved by this stage and said to the cathedral, you pinched him, you got all the grave goods, you can take it back. So in the end he was buried somewhere near where the font is, I think. But it's the sort of dispute that did kick off big time.
And of course that is one of the things that was the origin that you find in a lot of places in Devon of the posy tree, because that originated during the plague. As you know, corpses had to be carried to a parish that was actually licensed for burial, and particularly over Dartmoor they were carried over the Lichways or the Corpseways, quite a long way. I mean, Widdicombe was one of the burial places, wasn't it?
Only quite later. The main one was Lidford.
Yeah.
This is why they had to be carried all the way back to 2 months
Yeah.
on.
But the one of the problems was that people were very happy to receive the corpses in normal years because they got the money for them. The trouble was when at times when the plague broke out, the last thing you wanted was a neighbouring parish or a distant settlement bringing their plague corpses into your village that didn't have them. And there are a large number of incidents where the villagers heard that a plague corpse was coming and would go out and would actually bar the road with sickles and whatever farm implements that they actually had. And they would be forced to bury the corpse virtually where they were actually stopped because they couldn't take it back. And trees were planted to mark these positions. And these became known as posy trees because they hung the posies that they were carrying, the sweet-smelling herbs, on these trees that they had planted or laid them over the place where they had actually buried the corpse. And the posies were obviously there to ward off, the smell of the herbs was there to ward off the corpse, ward off the plague. So you find that an awful lot of places in Lincoln, in Devon and Dorset in particular have posy trees which are still somewhere on the outskirts of villages where the plague parties were actually stopped for that reason.
Oh, no, that's not. That's all right. That's just the warning. Not. There was another one, another story I always liked, which is back in the 1280s, I think it was, when there was a certain amount of dispute, and there was a little bit of company politics that went a bit haywire, because the precentor of the cathedral went through the service of Matins, and at the end of Matins he left the cathedral to walk about 30 yards to his house. And he was set upon in the middle of the cathedral yard, beaten up and stabbed to death by 20-odd people. And it was a shocking event. I mean, this is the middle of the night. It was about 1 or 2 in the morning because it was after Matins. So it's because of that event that subsequently Exeter Cathedral had the wall placed around the cathedral precinct, because it was to stop people coming in, because they discovered that all these 20 people, these ruffians, had come in from outside the city. And what had happened was that as curfew was called, the Southgate porter actually didn't lock the gates, and there was this gathering of people in the darkness outside the city, and they came into the city at about midnight and concealed themselves in Exeter Cathedral grounds, waiting just for this one bloke. And what was actually happening was the bloke was a friend of the dean of the cathedral. It was a guy called John Pycott, or John of Exeter, and he had a dispute with the bishop. They didn't see eye to eye on certain things, such as the dean also being treasurer, because he was pinching quite a lot of money. And you were only supposed to have one position, one post in the cathedral. It was a good ecclesiastical rule to stop fraud and corruption. But Pycott was a good old boy, as I say. He was known as John of Exeter for a reason, whereas Bishop Branscombe, I think, came from Kent. So he wasn't looked upon in quite the same light as good old John. And the bishop thought he's got to try to clip this guy's wings a bit. So he got a precentor, Walter de Lechlade, who was a bit of a bully, and he made Lechlade his second in command within the chapter. So on occasion it was noted that the dean, when he went into the cathedral and tried to sit in the dean's chair, de Lechlade had his feet on it. And little things like that. It was niggling. It was company politics. And so what happened was that there was a lot of debate and discussion about who could these ruffians have been. And de Lechlade had a brother, I forget his name offhand, who was quite upset by this, and so was the bishop. And so they petitioned the king, Edward I, to come down and investigate exactly who was responsible. It took 2 years, but eventually the king did turn up. And the king arrived on the day before Christmas Eve, and he opened his court on Christmas Eve, and they adjourned for Christmas Day, and they hanged 7 people on Boxing Day, because they were fairly quick in those days, so quite nice. And they also arrested a lot of other people. 2 of the perpetrators was the vicars of Heavitree and Ottery St Mary, and almost all of the other people involved were members of the cathedral, well, members of cathedral staff or church staff for these other guys, because they were supporters of John Pycott, and they wanted to support him come what may. And so when he said, well, we've got to get rid of this guy, they said, all right. The company politics in those days was a bit more serious. But it's also a nice case of corporate responsibility too, because one of the more important people who were hanged, there were 2 from the city. One was the porter of the South Gate, because he had broken curfew letting these people in, and the other one was the mayor was hanged. It was the only time, I think, in British history that a mayor has been hanged while serving in office. And the reason was, I don't think our current set of politicians would approve of this too much, but the idea was that he was the representative of the city. The city had failed in allowing these guys to get in, so the representative had to pay the price. Tell that to a politician today, and you'd probably... But I found that one out, what I discovered, a strange little book in the British Library, and it's lovely, because you go away to do research, and you think you're focused on one direction, like bloody Widdicombe Fair, and you get nice little side tracks into other directions, don't you?
Absolutely. I mean, going back to sort of laws that we could perhaps bring back, I mean, one of the other ones was that if you were, that people in those days had to take responsibility for ditching and draining their land and making sure that their neighbours' land didn't flood and keeping up the ditches. And one of the punishments that could be prescribed was that if you allowed your neighbour's land to drown, to flood, and caused his cattle or anyone else to actually drown as a result, you could be buried up to the neck in as part of the flood defences. Which might concentrate the minds of some of our councillors were that law to be brought back into Devon, which I thought was...
I can think of several people with it. Now, you know that floodplain beyond Tesco's?
Yes. It's not just Molehaven showing off their ways. There's other possibilities.
I still got, I've got to admit, I say it often, but one of the things I like is that I write series books, because when you've got a series, you invent the characters once and you can reuse them. You don't have to kill them all off. But other people think they've got to reinvent the wheel every single time. It seems like so much hard work.
Well, that's why I don't write as many as she does.
You've never reused any of your characters?
I have cameo appearances in the end. Company of Liars was my first novel that was narrated by the Camelot, and that character has a cameo appearance right at the very end of the Owl Killer. So I do occasionally have hidden cameos, but you've got to know the books to find them. So I sort of do it like that. No, frankly, when I've written about the characters, I've said all I want to say about them by the time I've gotten to the end of the thing. And yes, I do like killing them off. One of the things that I hated as a child when I used to read books as a child, or the books that were imposed on us as a child, particularly at school, were things like Moonfleet, Treasure Island, all of those sorts of things, which apart from always having all male characters, and the only thing a woman ever got to do was to kind of wave a hanky from the balcony, and even in Wind in the Willows, the only female character is the washerwoman. I mean, you know, where's that go? But one of the things that I really used to hate about those sorts of classics was the fact that they were never in any real danger, because you knew that the hero was going to survive.
Not in your books.
Well, that was the point. That was my kind of epiphany came when I was about 13 or 14 and read Graham Greene for the first time, The Power and the Glory. And I probably didn't understand all of it, but the great thing was, not only was he this wonderful anti-hero, who had bad breath, was overweight, had bad teeth, and so on and so forth, which was probably more or less how I felt at about 13 or 14. So I kind of identified with this whiskey priest alcoholic, strangely. But also it was the fact that at the end of the book he gets taken prisoner, and you don't know whether he's going to be executed, but you think he's going to be executed. And I thought, thank goodness, there was real danger in that book. You don't know whether he's going to survive or not. And that's always been a principle in my book, that you never know who is actually going to get killed off in my book, and it could well be the narrator. So, and I like that sense of danger, that you don't know whether it is going to be the hero or the villain that's going to survive the thing at the end. So that's kind of why I write.
That's fair enough. I do have that with my... I've got a Vintner trilogy, which is about the 100 Years' War. So the first book, Fields of Glory, is all about the march to Cressy and the battle. The second book is about the siege of Calais, more or less. And then the third book was 10 years later on Poitiers. And that was fun because I did have a whole bunch of different archers in this vintage. It's sort of Band of Brothers for the 100 Years' War. And with that I was able to kill off an awful lot of them, but just keep a small core which could then be built up again for the other books. That's, yes, it is satisfying when you kill them off, isn't it?
It is. And one of the great things about
We're being offered tea, I think.
being a historical writer is that you can... all of those people that were really mean to you when you were a child, you can write as a character. They will never recognise themselves because it's a historical character, and you can kill them in the most horrible and tortuous way. You get immense satisfaction from doing it. Very cathartic. I'd recommend it.
Yes, I'm being recorded, so I won't say his name. He's died very painfully lots of times.
We'll take a little break at this point. We will, Karen. You'll notice that Susanna and Bernie are watching over you. Just pop that in between you in case. The friends have very kindly produced tea and coffee and biscuits around the corner. This is included as part of your ticket price. If you wish to make a donation, there is a little bowl for you to do so on the table. It is entirely up to you. Mike and Karen are also giving of their time freely for this event as well, for which we thank them very much. If you wish to support them too, then you can buy their books.
I like him.
You can buy their books and they will write little messages in the front. If you wish to read any of their books that they haven't got for sale, I've put a large amount of library stock also and left one of the self-service machines on, so you can borrow books that they haven't brought for you to buy too.
But it's not a library event, so.
But you can put my issue statistics up by taking those.
All good.
How long would you like to break?
10-15 minutes.
10-15 minutes,
Yep.
we'll reconvene. These two will regale you some more, and then you can ask some intelligent and pertinent questions back the other way. Thank you.
Or cheeky and impertinent, but probably have
Well, Cam and Tracey will do that.
Yeah.
Thank you.